easy. No, I'd split my time between the two. I technically live in Leesburg, but I don't. I'm only there half the time. She was gonna lead us up there, is kind of what she said. We were gonna follow her up, and she'd go all the way to the end, and we'd fill in behind her. So I work with you guys all the time, but you and I haven't crossed paths yet, I guess. Talk to Quay all the time. I work a lot with Obidal on C2 Next. Okay. I had a bunch of engagements with Steckman and Palmer in the very early days of IVAS. I was the IVAS guy at Microsoft. So, yeah. I'm going to be Mr. Bang for now since I don't have one. You guys are for sure exploding.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The program will begin shortly, so please begin moving to your seats. We'd ask you to stay seated at the conclusion of this presentation. We have another brief ceremony following the end of the panel. Thank you.
You'll also eventually land some contracts that have some boring work that don't have exquisite salaries associated with it, right? Right. We actually need a .NET programmer who's not worth a whole lot, right? You know? We're gonna need some program managers, yeah. Junior program managers. Otherwise, the overhead rate's gonna be 5. You know?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Please welcome the Future Focus panel to the stage.
mean, there's still plenty. Mics are on.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Are we ready to get started? Okay. So before we introduce the panel, we're going to kick it off with a few words from Mr. Bang. Can you guys play the
Everything that
video?
we do, all the weapon systems that you saw, whether it's the AMPV, the ISV, the RCV that you saw all over there, awesome, exquisite weapon systems that we're building. But all of that is underpinned by digital technologies. And right now, we have a lot of people that are coming up, soldiers, junior officers that were born native to this digital era. A lot of us at the senior levels understand it. We might be digitally enabled, but they live it. And we really have to get more people, one, educated, and we have to get more help from industry to help us really transform and accelerate. And that's kind of what we're talking about. Modernization is a given. It's table stakes. We're doing that right now. You'll see later on what we're delivering. But really, we really need help with this digital transformation.
Thanks, Mr. Bang. Was that actually Mr. Bang, though? No? Yeah, I mean, anyone that knows Mr. Bang, and I spent a lot of time with him, like, that was not him. Those are not his mannerisms. There was, you could very easily identify, if you look closely, that there were some, like, weird, like, very kind of robotic movements and things that were not Mr. Bang at all. But if you don't know Mr. Bang, you might not be too sure, because you might not pay attention to, blinking patterns that seem like pretty, pretty methodical. And I think it really lends, I would say, reality to the fact that deepfakes are a big problem, right? And it's something that is one of the things that we are very concerned about as we embark on what are we doing with AI in the Army. So, good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Swanson. I am the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Data Engineering and Software with an ASALT, and I work very closely with Mr. Bang, who is the PDEP on all things digital transformation. I am super excited about our panel today. We have a very, very, very fantastic industry panel up here, and they're going to help us to define what are the things that we really should be thinking about as we move forward with AI in the Army. So if you guys could, we'll start with you, Alex. Introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm Alex Adamczyk. I'm LMI's Vice President of Advanced Analytics and AI. So I'm a data scientist by training and practice, but now lead our data science group at LMI. So we're a mid-sized contractor. We provide data science, data engineering, development services to the Army, Navy, and other civilian agencies as well. Great to meet you all.
Good afternoon, everybody. Mick Wimbrough. So I lead the Army team at Microsoft. I don't think Microsoft needs a whole lot of introduction, but across the gamut of delivery to the mill depths, we deliver comm software, we deliver artificial intelligence, we deliver cloud computing, we deliver desktop software, we deliver cybersecurity at all the classified enclaves.
Great. Kunal Sharma. I'm the co-lead of the public sector team at Anthropic, which is a frontier AI lab, the creator of the Claude family of models, and happy to be here.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Orlowski, lead the land systems team at Anduril Industries. Similar, probably a lot of folks have seen our videos and our pretty strong marketing campaign that we do to promote the company. But we do have, relevant to this discussion, artificial intelligence models deployed, not necessarily all internally developed, a lot of integrated by third parties, both to protect the homeland and overseas without getting into too much trouble, just as a broad strokes. And then just as an interesting, as we talk in software and like leading into programs, was we at the forefront with the RCV team. My last job in the Army was the PM for RCV, retired last year. And we established one of the first software acquisition pathway programs, which I like to joke a lot publicly specifically, is it was a lot of choose your own adventure when you would turn the next page, and then there would be nothing on that next page, as we did a lot of discovery learning and set some precedents for the Army that I hope are good ones, but we'll find out as the program continues to deliver over the next few years. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome, thank you. And thanks to all of you for coming. We're very excited to have you here. So, I think it's a fantastic panel for many reasons. I mean, you guys obviously all have very deep experience in these technologies that are going to be very important to the Army as we evolve what we're doing with AI. You also represent different kinds of companies that we like to work with, right? We've got some big ones, we've got smaller ones, we've got folks that are more focused on defense, folks that really are commercial, non-traditional. So I think you bring a wealth of different backgrounds and experiences that are really going to be interesting for us to hear what you have to say. So we talked a lot. I'm not going to go through all the stuff we talked about earlier on the panel at 12, but we're certainly moving forward quickly with defining what are the things that we want to do in the AI space for the Army. We have Project Linchpin that is going to be our flagship AI program, secure MLOps ecosystem to help all of our other PMs develop and also adopt third-party algorithms as we define use cases and requirements. And there's a lot kind of caught up in that. Some of the things that we found as gaps are testing, how do you test things that aren't deterministic, securing algorithms, making sure that we aren't putting things out there that can be then used against us, making sure that they're providing the right information at the right time to soldiers, all of that. So within that context and other things, if there's things that you guys see that we're not seeing, what are some emerging technologies or concepts that you are working on that you're seeing in your space that you think we should be looking at? Anybody can start. Chris, you want to go first?
Sure, I can go first. So having worked on both sides, I see there's been a lot of focus on individual control of specific platforms, whether it's maritime, air domain, ground domain, et cetera. And then there's a lot of jumping to how do you control lots of them? And I think one of the areas that loses a lot of work or needs a little more focus and can be focus of additional emerging technologies is how do you control 3 or 5? And do it in a way that the soldiers, whether it's behavior tree development or other ways to get at collaborative autonomy, mission autonomy, however you want to phrase it. But soldiers, Marines, more generic warfare is how do they just employ a couple of systems and they go do a task? And they do that task very well, and they do that real task reliably and in a more production sense as opposed to more test and experimentation sense where it's only going to work in certain environments. That to me is one of those areas where it's emerging. We're starting to look at it. I know there's a lot of other companies, startups more mature that are looking at it as well. But I think we quickly, and I think on the user side too, want to jump to how do we do a lot of this? But let's do small things effectively, and then you can start scaling that in a broader sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So I think from my perspective as somebody whose job it is to translate a giant commercial company's products back to a MILDEP is that we talk a lot about the very exquisite applications of artificial intelligence. We talk a lot about battlefield autonomy, decision dominance, automated targeting, problems that are super hard that we've never really solved. I think the other thing that's going to happen quietly is that the more mundane problems will also be accelerated by the use of AI. There are a lot of things across all the warfighting functions, from logistics to cybersecurity to other aspects of operating a global defense force that are going to be significantly accelerated and advanced by the infusion of some tech. And then the other thing that kind of dovetails right into the back of that is watching the Army evolve to use more commercial communications platforms makes this more real faster. As we talk about the proliferation of LEO and we begin to use commercial networking for colorless core, accessing all the infrastructure required to use these very exquisite technologies is more real than it's ever been for the first time. Getting it to the edge is possible now.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. I think we are going to have to be careful what we're doing at the edge because we will rapidly overwhelm any network that we have, as we always do. But so I am not sure we're going to be training stuff, but certainly using things, I agree with you. I mean, the comms are getting better and better. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think one thing, from the Anthropic side, and so for folks who may not be as familiar, to newer entrant to the USG space, strongly committed to the space, there's a few aspects I think that are interesting for us to consider from the Army perspective. The first is, how do we determine if these models are effective for specific use cases, right? So Anthropic this year built, by several metrics, the world's most performant LLM twice. There's that in a general sense, but from the Army sense, we need to understand its relevance to specific use cases, right? So there's that element. And then there's a second component, which is how to do this securely. So Mr. Bing obviously gave a presentation about this earlier today. But one of the things that, for folks' awareness that we spent a lot of time thinking about is how to red team and then build these models to be highly resistant to jailbreaking, and to then basically put an MRI over the model to understand what's happening inside of it so that we can learn how to steer it. And that's called steerability science. So Anthropic spends a lot of time thinking about that. I think the next phase of this is how that relates in our community to the types of problems we're facing in the DoD for the types of use cases we have. And so these are some of the things we're thinking about. What is happening inside of the model? How is that relevant to make it secure for whether it's the soldier or to the ultimate decision maker in a specific mission case?
So, I think there's huge applicability in our space because that is really kind of that's the T in torque, right? That we talk about for Project Linchpin is we want transparency of the models and be able to understand what is inside of them. How would we apply something like that to say, or could we apply something like that to a third-party model? Because I think where we have, I would say industry has some concerns about like how transparent do we really want to be?
Yeah, so I think one way I'll start off with that is we publish our research like in peer-reviewed journals on the way that we are red teaming models as we build them. So I think one place to start is the evaluations and approaches that are there already. I think a second thing that's interesting is to have those conversations between government and industry, in this case the DoD side, over what is most relevant in this domain to actually red team. If we're thinking about jailbreak resistance, what are the things that we don't want to be able to jailbreak that are relevant for the Army, right? So let's identify those, right? Separate from like the broad world of how do you make a safe social model, there's a separate aspect that's relevant for the Army. So there's a discussion component there. And then I think there's a second opportunity, it could be through the Linchpin pipeline as well, which is evaluating, Colonel Anderson mentioned, basically V&V, is this performant, is it secure? As a component of performance, there could be, it's obviously not up to me, but there could be a discussion of how does it perform for specific use cases, right? So is it performant in general, is the patient alive? Yes, but for which type of situation, right? And so I think there's an opportunity there for, collaboration.
Makes a lot of sense.
And I think one thing I'll add is all of these technology shifts take longer, but in the long term are much more transformative than we think early on. So if you think about the internet, we are multiple decades into the internet, but how we work and educate our children has changed drastically in the last 5 years. And so it took decades of that technology maturing and rolling out for people to find all the other applications of it. And then also for us to reorganize our society and our organizations and our institutions to use this technology. And so it's going to take a long time for these early advances that are coming out of Anthropic for us to find the right use cases for them, to mature them. And what we see, I think Linchpin's a good example of this, of doing this the first time and building those MOps pipelines is really, really hard. But doing it the second through 100th time is much, much easier. And so I think that's what I'm most excited about over the next 5 to 10 years is the proliferation of this across the Army as these technologies become more and more mature and more democratized, where we're using them outside of just our exquisite problems. They're out at the edge, they're out with soldiers in the field, not just at a giant cluster back where we have supercomputers or a hyperscaler to use those resources. So I think it's going to be a long time until we kind of mature organizations around what these technologies can do.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that there is. I do feel like we're in a little bit of an AI bubble generally, just because LLMs hit and they hit fast and hard, and people really saw value, but then saw some of the issues that we still have, right? And there are things that we're trying to solve. I think everybody's trying to solve, like testability and security and those types of things where. There's certainly advantages that LLMs are giving us right now, but to your point, they're not things that are going to tell soldiers, fire here. But there's also other issues that we just haven't solved yet because it's new. And so I think it will certainly take some time. But we also have to be cognizant of the fact that our adversaries are heavily investing in the same technologies, and we have to be ahead. I mean, there's no option there. And so I think it will take time, but we want it to take as little time as possible. So in our space, integration across different programs, different technologies is always a huge challenge. I have basically lived this. I keep forgetting I wear a mic. I have lived this my entire career pretty much because I've been in roles where I had a lot of responsibility to try to do integration across different programs that weren't built that way, weren't born that way at all. It was kind of like, hey, we're doing all these different things in a stovepipe fashion, and now we're going to put it all together, and that's not a very good way to do it. So that's why we're trying to now really build out standards and provide those standards and architectures for our programs to build into. But it's still hard because our model is, and it's not going to change. Our model is we compete products, programs, different vendors are going to win those contracts, and then there is still a need to do integration. So in your spaces, in your organizations or companies, how do you manage through that? Do you have the ability to control your whole environment, which is fantastic, or do you have to deal with integration of disparate products, and if so, how does that work?
Well, in some sense, it's a way of, it could be a different way of looking at how you actually compete a program. So the one that Anduril has that we laud as, obviously we have a preference for it, is with PM counterproliferation, which is the counter UAS work for SOCOM. And it's called the System Integration Partner. And the program office set that up for a competition. So we as a company had to win and demonstrate you could move fast, integrate third parties. And to this day, I get the emails almost daily about a new task order, but it's often not, and I'm not involved, somehow I got on this email distribution list. It's a lot of third-party integrations. It's not all of our, maybe the software baseline is ours, we own the overall performance of the system, but there are directed third-party integrations. There are where we go evaluate and say, well, this is actually the best third-party thing for you to integrate, software and or hardware, and that we do that as a company. Now, that model is a bit unique. It could be applied in other places and tried out. But even back to when I was on the government side, we always struggle with, it's probably the right thing eventually for RCV to have a similar model or other programs like that. But how do you select that integrator up front? And that's, because if you do it off paper, you're going to add a lot of risk. So how do you make sure there's a competition up front too? So I think there's ways to do that. There's innovative ways to continue to do that and look at how you can apply that to other programs.
Yeah, one of the things that we really want to do, I think, is clearly we're trying to stay away from the term integrator because it has negative connotations to some things that have maybe not gone so well in the past, but we still need that function. We still need that role. We're going to have a bunch of stuff that needs to come together. Somebody's got to do that. We do want closer ties to the subs, right? What we don't want to do is just say, okay, integrator, here you go. You guys take care of all of it and just give us back a final product, because the outcome is not sometimes what we want it to be. And it depends on who has the contract. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's in between. But I'm hopeful that maybe if we have more links to the actual smalls, non-traditionals, companies that are maybe providing some of those products that need to be integrated across, that it gets a little bit better. We'll see.
And there's ways to do that too. You can always ask if there's a prime that's responsible for the overall system, and there's directed subs, and you can put language in both of those contracts, thou shalt work together, and pay them to do so. But ultimately, somebody, I think, has to be responsible for the overall performance of the system, and because the government always wants somebody to go beat up if things aren't working right.
Well, yeah, we're trying to work through how we got to get what we pay for and get what we need, but it has to be effective and efficient. So how does Anthropic, you guys are very tightly, I would say, tied to other companies, right? You're not working in a vacuum. So how are you looking at that?
Yeah, so I think for folks' general awareness who may not be familiar, So Anthropic has partnerships with 2 large CSPs, AWS and Google Cloud is available via both in the commercial world. So Anthropic's an independent company. We don't have members of those companies on our board, for example. This is important to the way that we sort of see our role relevant to others. I think a second component of this is the way that we interact. We talked about research and red teaming before. So I should clarify too that when we do that, we partner with third-party organizations, right, to red team our models, right? So there are specific ways and items that they bring to bear, but obviously one of the critical components of this is that process, because that doesn't just become research that feeds back into the model engineering itself. So it is a direct loop, and that's critical to us to have those partners in industry. And I think a third thing that's obviously critical, as we know, is especially in the government space, the way to touch and interact with these models is quite complicated when you're talking about connecting it to systems and programs of record, especially when you're in the air-gapped space. And so it's a reality of this space as well that we need to partner with other organizations who might be on the application or services side of this, right? We do not have the intent, probably, I would also say, but we're not set up and interested to go down that route. The route is really to partner with the folks who are already excel in that, and that if our model's API is feeding some application that somebody creates that happens to be useful, that's great. So for us, we want to make sure that we're bringing the best capability that's the safest to the end users. Obviously, I'm biased for our own, but that's really the way that we see it. So we're trying to be interoperable and accessible to others, and we care about being valuable. We do want to make sure that it's working and it's working well for the users.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I've got, a kind of a commercial perspective on this. As a platform company, our job is to make this tractable for our customers. So Army is Microsoft's largest enterprise customer. The others are the Fortune 10 companies you'd expect them to be. And as I talk to my peers across the Microsoft business, one glimmer of hope I can offer to you is this is not a unique to Army problem. This is hard everywhere. So, they don't often have the complexities of the FAR and acquisitions law to go through, but it's still a difficult problem. So when we think about it from the platform provider perspective, I think I'm encouraged by a lot of the directions I see the Army going in. Like, for example, we have simple frameworks for adoption. Like, the framework for adoption of AI is 4 points. Modify or modernize your application platform, right? You have to build a modern app that somebody wants to use that can deliver AI. Like, that's pretty clear. We're getting after some of that with your modern software initiatives and that type of stuff, right? You have to modernize and modify your data platform. You have to have that accessible data available to the users and to the models and to the model trainers and all at once. You got to have the canonical data source, and there's been a lot of effort put into that, so that's encouraging. Then you have to pick your AI platform. Kunal has talked a lot about how you choose and modify that. Like, the actual math is important. Which LLM do you want? How do you manage it? How do you test it? How do you validate it? In other machine learning scenarios, it's not different. And then the fourth line of that is you have to pick the infrastructure that allows you to train, inference, and exploit that stuff. And if you stick to that modular principle coupled by standards, it becomes a slightly more tractable problem. I realize that in the Army space, we carry a lot of legacy tech debt, and it's hard to replace things quickly, but I feel encouraged that we're going forward in a direction that's probably going to help us grow out of some of this in the long run.
Yeah, we really are. And we are trying to be very focused on how we modernize in the right way. Obviously, we have to keep eyes on legacy because we need interoperability, but we don't want that to slow our roll, right? So we need to do it in a way where we're going to build the bridge where we need to from legacy to new, but not slow down new because we've got the legacy stuff. We're trying really hard to figure that out. And from a contracting perspective, the Digital Capability Center of Excellence and my team are partnered. We're going to be putting out an RFI soon that really is seeking feedback on how do we best contract for AI type capabilities. We have these we've done a lot of work in the software space. How do we incentivize industry? What are the things that we should ask for? How do we make sure that, we get what we need, and that obviously industry has the opportunity to invest in the right places? AI is different. And so what are the best mechanisms that we can use? So I think that'll try to help us get after some of the things that you said, Mick.
Yes, ma'am. My only the semi-contradictory remark to that is AI is not an outcome in and of itself, right? It's never, the mission is never go do AI.
Right,
We're
right.
always trying to achieve some other outcome, so it dovetails into everything else we
Yep.
do.
Yeah, that's true. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I'm spoiled as a data science leader that I have a lot of data scientists internal that if I have a problem, we can go spin up a model and build something internal for it. And so it's fun. I see the Army side of it, and then I see our side of it. And so what we've settled on is more of a golden path approach of some of our teams don't have a strong opinion on 90% of the tech stack. And so if you don't have an opinion, there are pre-built containers. We've built them once. We've educated you. When you stand up your team, there's a team that shows you, here's the documentation on how we've done this before. And if you don't know or have a strong opinion about that, that's great. That helps them start with a great starting foundation. But and all of this is moving so fast, we don't mandate that anyone uses that full stack. And so we leave it up to the teams to come back and say, I picked whatever new tool instead of that. And it's a way for us to explore new tools, and they could build their things out, bring it into production. All we ask is then they back brief our R&D group and our leaders on what the new tool they picked out, what the pros and cons were, and why they did it. And so it lets us continue to not reinvent the wheel as much as possible in the tools we're building, but kind of use ourselves as a test bed for what is that new piece. And some of them are niche to one particular problem, and we don't end up rolling them into our golden path, whereas other of them, there are problems with our current tech stack or the way, and we're not the only ones that run into that problem, that the tools continue to evolve, and we'll swap that out, and then the next version of that, or we may have multiple packages available for folks to kind of pick up with pre-built containers. But I think for one of us is just the realization that everything moves way too quickly for us to mandate this is the way to go do it, because it's too quickly changing to tell people or to constantly centrally manage this is what the best path is going to look like.
Yeah, no, 100%. And that's how we're trying to set up Linchpin. And that's why you'll never see anything coming out of ASALT mandating that you use this tool or that tool, because that's nonsensical to me and to Mr. Bang. So, and it doesn't inspire competition. Like, we want the best mousetrap that we can get when it's available. That's interesting. It would be good to follow up with you with the Linchpin team as well, because that really is what we are trying to do, is build this flexible and extensible ecosystem that allows us to plug and play different components, different tools, different things at different times.
And I think it's been great to see just the intellectual honesty from the data science team. So if they see or hear or read some blog post about some cool new tool, and they go look at it and realize, and we've seen a couple ones where they said, we thought this was going to be way better, but unless you hit X scale, the tool we'd been using already was fine.
Yeah.
And that's great. And now we know that, and so we have that kind of in our roadmap of, if we ever do hit whatever scale in this database, we know which tool to fall over to, but we're not kind of wondering that, so do we pick the right tool?
Yeah, yeah, that's very interesting. So, I'm excited about our AI path. I mean, I think, from a digital transformation perspective, I'm really excited about the things that we've been able to accomplish and the things that we're, laying the groundwork to continue accomplishing. But it does not come without challenges. We know that, right? It's not just going to all magically come together. So in this space, and I think you guys have some familiarity with what we're thinking about in AI and what we know anyway. We don't know it all, but, of what we know, I think you guys are tracking that. What are some challenges that you think we need to be aware of, and some potential solutions to those challenges?
So
Anybody can start.
Yeah, I can start with this one. I think one of the cultural things I've seen, not necessarily with the Army, but across government, is a lot of times the decision makers trying to pick the prioritization are by nature senior in the organization. But by where you sit, the problems that show up at senior leaders' desks on a regular basis are atypical. And so the problem of the day that a senior leader is worried about is something that the organization doesn't deal with, because otherwise it wouldn't have ended up on your desk. And I think there is an appetite for solving whatever the highest profile problem is that's on the most senior person's desk. But typically, those ad hoc one-off things, there's not as much training data. They're different than the regular organization. And so I think in order to have some kind of high-profile win, sometimes organizations pick the wrong problems, where picking some back office thing about making sure that the logistics system is 5% more effective, or when you go to the range, is there the right amount of ammo waiting there for you where you didn't overorder? Those problems that no senior leader is ever going to hear about are great for AI. And I think sometimes they just don't show up on the list, in the hit list for prioritization, because the way we make these lists is we get a bunch of senior folks in the room, and what are the most important problems to you? And all of those mundane things that the senior leaders don't have to worry about never show up on that quad chart for ranking and racking and stacking.
That does make a lot of sense, because you're right. I mean, what my team can solve on their own, they solve on their own, and I'm not even aware of it. But the things that I'm aware of are probably unique, kind of one-off situations. So that is a very interesting perspective. And it's funny you mentioned ammo, because we did a UDRA 100-day implementation plan recently, and ammo was the area that we picked in terms of how much ammo do I need and how much ammo do I have, which sounds like an easy problem, but it's not, because our systems are legacy and they don't provide that. It's like a really, really long, laborious process. And so we were able to demonstrate with using some different systems that we have and UDRA data product, compliant data products, that we can do it instantaneously. And so that was something that, you're right. I mean, I didn't know we couldn't do that, but we couldn't.
Pick that one because JMC is doing some incredible work on predictive modeling and moving out of the old system of a human said, here's how much ammo I want, and they knew they were going to get that, so they double it or triple it. And so JMC is doing some fantastic work around that behind the scenes that I think no one knows that they're as sophisticated as they are on some of these ML models and some of the ML ops they've rolled out, because it isn't. It won't ever show up on the senior leaders' desks because they're doing such a good job.
Yeah, that's very interesting insight. Thank you.
So when I was thinking about this question, I think you've alluded to it several times already, man. My number one blocker that I see to adopting and scaling new tech is our old tech.
Yeah.
We got to get past the legacy problem, but you've highlighted a couple of times where we've built intermediaries to get us through. You talked about using UDRA to bridge the ammo systems. I think, some of the work that's going on in the EBSC OTA to build agility layers in between systems we can't get rid of, highlight how we can avoid all or nothing scenarios.
Yep.
I think we've tended in the past to go to the rip and replace. Like, this thing's too old, we can't use it, we have to throw the whole thing out, let's go to Congress and get $11 zillion and try again.
Yeah.
And that's been the problem, and I think we're seeing positive change in the evolution away from that.
Yeah, I mean, Big Bang doesn't work. That's Big Bang. We've done it. Well, we tried. And it doesn't work. It's not effective. And so you're right. I mean, being able to use what we have, bridge it, and then evolve and build new stuff that is really, really modern is definitely the approach, yeah.
And I think of a concern I have both sides is there's this intermediate time where you're not necessarily delivering the capability or meeting the requirement, and it's going to take time and money to do that.
Yeah.
And as Neil mentioned earlier, like, what is the right application for a model? Often in like the autonomous vehicle space, like, what's the correct operational design domain? And it's not exclusive to that. But there's going to be time where it works in certain spots, it's not going to work in others. And the money to do that, the testing, the data collection, this putting hours on robots, as an example, is a cost that doesn't deliver a bullet, a tank, or a pair of boots. That in the budget drills and other things, is that going to survive? Like, is there going to be the patience going forward of, hey, we're working on this, we're showing progress, but then how do you make sure you're still defending the programs that are actually going to be implementing that going forward? And I think that's a concern I think we see on the industry side now too, is like, there's been a lot made about certain software programs, but when you go look at the J-books and see what they're funded to, like, the money's not there. And maybe that's an anomaly one year, and then the next year it'll be different. But those things and seeing those signals will help industry to invest. And like, where do we invest to meet you there? The promises are there, but that's one of the main concerns I have is making sure that that progress continues. Because if it doesn't stop, then the typical thing will go back 10 years. We'll wait 10 years before we try it again, and then we'll be way behind at that point.
Yeah, I mean, here's what I would say about that. You're right. Obviously, you should watch the money. We all should watch the money because the money does indicate where the big investments are being made. Money's tight right now in DoD. I don't think that's a big secret, right? It's been a flat budget, and inflation is, pretty high. And so that flat budget doesn't extend as far as it did 3 or 4 years ago. That said, we are prioritizing the money that we have against, the biggest programs and efforts that we want to invest in. I do think that there is more flexibility than we've ever had, especially with Congress. I think Congress, is understanding. I think there's better communication. I think they're understanding the need for flexibility more than they did before. But this is still an evolving acquisition enterprise, right, in terms of making sure that the money's in the right places. And also, it's incumbent on us to make sure we're doing the right things with the money. And I think that will go very far. And so that, I think, is what I'm most excited about with the digital transformation efforts that we've been leading, is I think it's going to get us to delivery of the right products at less cost, faster. That's really what's going to go the longest way in terms of making sure that we secure future money. So, but you're right, you should be watching the J-books, definitely.
Yeah, and then I can just add, from our side, when we think about these timelines, like 5 to 10 years, right? I think the thing that we should all keep in mind too, if we look at my company, other frontier labs, for example, we think that in the next 5 years, we will have a model that is capable of answering problems smarter than the smartest person alive. If that model, if we get there, right, okay, bold statement, if we get there, right, and that's like from our research teams, right, what does the delta look like between the government space and the commercial space? That, given the reality that we know about, acquisition timelines, et cetera, that is a challenge. If we actually have that big of a delta, that's a massive delta, right? So how do we, accommodate that in line with the fact that we have to go through certain processes for the right reasons, that we have to solve the right problems? That's one challenge. I think the second type of challenge is, we think about technology and data architectures typically in different data domains, right? This domain of data, this structure of data for that domain. I think the interesting thing here is with AI, we're kind of suggesting you can have cross-domain workflows, which if that happens, we already have a version of that today in a standard sense, but if you actually have this spanning across, it poses a challenge for how we tackle this from an acquisition standpoint. If we have the same electricity, quote unquote, flowing across what typically would be considered falling under different acquisition arms and offices, how do we now take that and harness that and do it in a cost-efficient way for the government, right, to be able to experiment with this? And so I think these are two challenges. I think obviously the fact that we're here today means we're in the right place, we're thinking about the right things, we have like great people trying to solve these problems. But I think those are two that I would put out in addition to what the other folks have said.
So as you do that, how generalizable do you think that's going to be to like more bespoke or unique problem sets for the Army? So I'll give you an example, like a little plug. I don't know the man, but if you want to read a good trilogy about how the Army's operation in the Pacific, for the Marines in the room, if there's any, we did a lot more landings than the Marines did. But John McManus wrote this series of books about the Army's experience in the Pacific. And what struck me when I read those books was he really focused on the logistics planning and how both the Army and the Marine Corps over years of operation learned the right loadouts of a ship for an amphibious operation. Like, this is what you put up front, this is the stuff, like the ice cream's way in the back, right? You don't need that right away. But that was built on experience, and I don't know if something does happen, if we will have the luxury of the time to build up that experience again. So I'm curious, like, as you guys see things going forward, because now I'm starting to get out of my technical depth, is loading a ship for transport for commercial goods and the way you do that to offload it appropriately. Are those types of things that could be generalized or applied to a different domain, as you mentioned, to like Army-specific problems or DoD-specific problems? So take it up a level.
Yeah. Can I answer?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. So there's a general intelligence of the model, right? Which is what if we look at, what these are my company, others, post online, these various benchmarks, evaluations. There's that standard, set of items, and then there's a second order question of the fact that today these models are powerful, but they're not taking actions in the real world, right? So they're not actually touching and moving things. There's obviously, I'm sure Chris, has a closer background than I do to that part of the engineering world, but there are ways where we can discuss or think about what that might look like down the future. What would it look like for these things to be embodied in robotic systems where they're actually touching and performing certain actions? And that's like a general, field of thought. There's a second component, which is for domain-specific use cases, right? There's a very good point that there needs to be an evaluation of what is needed for the model to be performant for those use cases. So if there's a niche operation occurring to load a ship, right, in a certain way that someone just needs to learn how to do, we know already that there are ways of prompting a model to get it to solve certain tasks like that. I think the thing that we need to look at, though, is there are cases where, depending on the task, or there are certain custom data that needs to be referenced as a part of the solution. So that's a standard approach that we're taking. And then there's a second, more higher firepower approach, which is if we need to fine-tune a model to be able to perform a certain task properly. And in the commercial world, we've done this at my company with firms that are trying to do this to have the model reflect a certain tone, knowledge, and set of data to respond to particular types of inquiries. So we could imagine what would that look like in our world. And a similar process could be done, but obviously, we're in early stages here about what that would look like and what that would involve.
Yeah, that's really interesting, though, because, to your point, we're going to have no time to do what we need to do, and we don't have years and years to learn it. So it's interesting to think about the power of AI and how it could really help us to, bridge the gap, if you will, and do things a lot more quickly and effectively than we're able to do today. Yep, definitely a lot there. So the last question, and then we'll transition to see if there's some questions from the audience. So, I think we, Army, ASALT, have been very transparent for the last several years at least with industry in terms of sharing everything that we've got, telling you guys what we're looking for, evolving efforts based on industry feedback, because we want to make sure that number one, we know we can't do anything without industry. Number two, we want to make sure that what we put out there is executable and can be delivered, right? That we're not missing things. And number three, we want to open up the playing field. Like, we want to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to compete in our space and not shut anybody out inadvertently. So we've become very good at, I think, listening. So with that in mind, you all kind of represent different parts of the, I don't want to call it the defense sector, because some of you really are commercial, but you are all supporting defense, right? And you represent different parts of it. So what sorts of partnerships do you think that we should be forming with companies like yours? What do you think that your company or your sector can bring to the table to help advance this whole effort for us?
So I was encouraged by some remarks from you today, and even when we were prepping before, because one concerns I've had is dictating exactly the tooling or the how somebody's supposed to go out in development. And I've even talked to some people like, well, we think we want to own the development environment. It's like, well, if you want to do that, I mean, the government has the rights. It's like, hey, we really, for security reasons, for whatever, we want to own or like have a heavy hand on what the development environment looks like. And things like the Army is doing with linchpin and all I'm encouraged by it, but it's because you're asking what those tooling is. And if you are going to make a shift, then I'd say we'll partner with it. It's like, hey, be cognizant of, like, if we're really going to ask you to do something different, like, what I learned on both sides is like everybody uses something different, and everybody's going to choose like a different part of the tooling to roll their own. Like they might use a third party to help, or then this other part, like I want to do it myself because we can do it faster. We're not going to use a third party labeling. We're just going to do it ourselves, as an example. Those things, like if you really continue that conversation and set those expectations before a program gets going, like this is what we're going to use, and like it's always the holy trinity of cost, schedule, and performance. Understand there's probably going to be some schedule hits and some performance hits initially, but having to continue that partnership, I think, will be good for everybody.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, we are not going to mandate tools, or really, we're not going to tell you guys how to suck the egg. There may be things that we start to require from a security perspective, like data security solutions, right? We're looking at what would a policy look like that would require everybody that's doing any work for the government to have a data security solution that provides these things. Because, I mean, we know what the risk is, right? I think you guys all know that. But we're not going to tell you what solution to buy. We're not going to say, go buy this box or that box. We're going to say, we need you to do, have something that does these types of things. And so things along those lines, you may see some requirements coming down, but it's still not going to limit your flexibility to do what you can do best with what you've got and what your people know how to do.
So Leslie, one of the things that I worry about is that next wave of democratizing AI across the Army is we're just going to need a lot more data scientists working with the Army than we have today. And I think the path down linchpin makes sense of getting everything set up in the infrastructure and getting things organized. But I worry about if there are 100 different units in the Army that are all trying to build data science teams, and they're all smaller projects, like they're not all giant projects. Is the Army going to be able to get all the support it needs, or are some of these not going to happen because they die in the acquisition process, the budget process, the requirements process? There's so many reasons to, especially for like a mid-sized problem, to not go through all the overhead right now. I think there's more we can do to make sure that once these platforms are there, everyone can go use them and scale them up and get the full value of them. Because I worry if it takes as long as it takes today to stand up a new team and start working on that, it'll be really hard for folks to go do those 100 and 200 other projects they want to do.
No, that makes sense. And I think, I think there's a lot of experimentation that's happening right now, right? And so units are doing some really cool things, and that's great. But I don't think that necessarily, the intent of that is not to scale it, right? So I think there's going to be some local efforts that happen. But I think the big efforts and the stuff we're talking about is really how do we set up this ecosystem to be able to feed those demands so that they don't have to do it themselves. And that's kind of the intent. So yeah, I mean, you're right, because otherwise we're going to run out of a lot of things, including people and money. It's not scalable any other way.
So I think I like the partnership word you used, and as somebody representing a terminally non-traditional big software OEM, CSP/CSP, I appreciate the direction we're headed in terms of modularity of acquisition. There are lots of pieces of things that the Army does that we're really passionate about being part of, but we probably shouldn't be in charge of hardly any whole things. So, the further forward we go down that path and the better we get at, sort of the government owning the architecture and defining the standards between the blocks, it really makes a better together story and lets the Army get after the best of breed and rip and replace those smaller modules of systems. It just makes it more tractable for us to be interested in pieces of it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that's the only way for us to really be able to build that integration model and be able to inspire competition and plug and play tools.
And I think one thing that we try to bring to the table in this domain broadly is the research capacity. So, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of all of our papers are published online, but this strand of work of the interest of the firm and basically seeing itself part as a research and think tank lab and then putting its resources towards that direction, I think is something that a partnership would benefit from. We'd love to be able to bring that to the table. We'd love to be able to collaborate with others that are tackling that from a different perspective. There's a research community out there that's represented by people in industry and academia and government. So I think that would be a really interesting, path forward. And then I think a second item here is, obviously there's partnership in potential discovery of use cases and in building potential evaluation benchmarks for Army use cases. So, Chris has made the right point that, what about for specific Army use cases, right? So imagine if we actually whiteboarded out a list of 10 of them, right, that are kind of reasonable and real workflows. You could imagine then asking the second question, for each of those, what are the things we want to test? So someone wants to summarize intel reports. Great. What are the 5 things they want to test? How do these models perform? How do we then say, okay, we need to either prompt engineer it or we need to fine tune it? Okay, we're past the graduation mark, right? That kind of thing to me is a partnership opportunity. It's not a one person, it's not a one team, right? And speaking for my company, we can't do that without a partner, right? We need that. So I think that's something that I would contribute as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think Anthropic's been great about, bringing some potential research opportunities to us as far as like, hey, we'd like to partner with you to do this, this kind of thing, which is awesome for us because there's a lot of research that still needs to be done. And like I said on the panel earlier, part of the 500-day AI implementation plan is standing up a forum that includes industry, academia, and government to really try to get after some of the bigger problems because they're problems that are plaguing everybody. And so I think, trying to put those big brains together will help us to solve those problems faster. So, all right, I think we have a little bit of time for questions left, if there are any.
Yes, ma'am. First question from the audience. Can you share any best practices or pitfalls when it comes to testing Gen AI solutions?
Well, that is not me that's going to answer that, so.
Do you want to go first?
Please, I just spoke. Go for it.
Yeah, we can get another hour on that. I think and I'm sure you'll add a lot to this, but I think what we've seen in working with Gen AI applications for the federal government is a lot of the training sets that are coming out of academia and industry aren't the types of questions and aren't what we're looking for the federal government. So we've been working on building out our own applicable data set of across the Army and the other folks that we're using these tools with. What are those tools that they need to be relevant for? What are the ground truth answers? Because there's nothing out there that we've been able to find from academia that is an applicable training and test set. And so I think that's one of the things as they start to roll out more and more inside the government is make sure we capture that so that as these models roll out, you have that ability to go continue to check them. And when that next version comes out, make sure you're not going to have regressions in the same way that you would do with the software package today. And so those tools the tools are available to check for the regressions, but there's a question about is the data set that is being used by a generic commercial company to talk about here's how we stack on the AI leaderboards the right data set for the Army? And I don't think it is. And the Army is going to need to build those data sets themselves to have it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I would very strongly emphasize the spirit of the data layer comment here, right? So we can interact with this in our own, chatbot that we're playing with on our phones, but in an enterprise context, this is critical. So the first thing that we need to avoid when we build anything is to ensure that the data that we need is, I'm assuming post-governance processes, once that's all there, that it's in many ways needs to be cut and chunked properly. We need to have the right data, and the way that it is cut, that basically means if you take text, you slice it into different sizes that the model can read and understand based on the use case. It is critical in any use case that we would ever do in the government at scale, that process, like the surgery of the data engineering, is done correctly, because when someone downstream hits the button and runs the question, they might get the wrong answer in their mind and say there's something like a hallucination going on, or we need to fine tune. And I would bet that we will hear comments like that generally, because it's not anyone's fault, but there needs to be proper education and transparency over the beginning of the pipeline, and then what do we need to do to make sure the end looks okay to somebody who may not necessarily care about what's happening before all of that. So I would double tap that point. And I think a second thing is that I would add as avoiding is we need to know when and when not to fine tune. Oftentimes, people jump to fine tune. They say, you know, my company is different, my culture is different, fine tune. That is a process that needs some more rigor to it. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to partner with folks to understand, based on the use case that they have, you know, is it actually fine tuning or is it really prompt engineering properly, which is like highly instructing the model what the rules are, and then pointing at the right data, and that handles a vast majority of those cases? Or is this really that we need to invest in the fine-tuning process? And so I think those are two things, a data layer, and then understanding, you know, when we need to get surgically involved, is it in the easier prompt engineering part, or is it in the more, you know, intensive, you know, fine-tuning part?
Yeah, I think they've both provided very solid answers, and there's a lot of academic research on how you grade and score model performance. I think one more pragmatic thing that I see fairly often is people asking the model questions it shouldn't know the answer to, and then trying to figure out why it doesn't know the answer. You can run yourself down a rabbit hole. You have to realize what the tool is actually for and make sure you're not misusing it before you start to evaluate what it's doing when it's being misused. To Kunil's point, you'll fine-tune things that aren't fine-tunable. It wasn't trained to even do such a thing. So that's a trap that's definitely fallen into with the very popular, very large LLMs that are generally deployed.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. And I think a lot of that has to do with the messaging in general. Like when you read anything in the media, AI can do everything. I mean, we are all going to be out of jobs very soon, so, which I don't believe. But, you know, I think people look at that and they're like, oh, this should be able to do everything I need it to do. And like you said, they're all very specific and niche, so. All right, do we have time for one more question?
Sure, we can do one more. As the TradeWinds OTA was launched a couple of years ago and the industry base grew within it, we noted immediately the difference in how many people used various terms. What role does your office, if not all of ASALT, and what role does industry play in adopting a common vernacular across the AI space within DoD?
I think that's actually a really, really good question. I think my office needs to play a role in adopting a lexicon that allows us all to kind of be speaking the same language. So we actually very, very recently, as part of our modern software framework development effort, which is really how do we develop architectures that allow us to do the integration stuff that we talked about before. We started with a dictionary of terms, and we just released that a couple of weeks ago. And we can debate whether those are the right terms or the wrong terms, and we're open to feedback, but at the end of the day, we need to all at least be saying the same things when we say words, and so that was really the intent there. I think within the space of AI, we need to do the same things, and it would be, I think industry plays a huge role because I'm sure you guys potentially have similar types of things within your organizations, and so we could take somewhat of, you know, the best of breed to develop ours. What do you guys think? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, words matter for sure.
Yeah, words definitely matter, and I think we fall into that trap a lot where we are actually potentially saying the same thing, but we're using different words and we just confuse each other. So yeah, definitely. Okay. Well, I think our time is up. I really, really appreciate you guys making the trip to Augusta and joining me for this panel. I think it was great for us for sure, and I hope that you guys get something out of it as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists for joining us today. AFCEA would also like to thank Parsons for supporting this year's TechNet Augusta Capture the Flag events. Today they hosted a session featuring middle and high school student participants. All of our winners either participated virtually or had to depart immediately following the competition, so we will not present awards on stage today. Thank you for your attention. The IDEA panel will begin shortly.
I got asked.